colleagues right across the House. There is a private member's enabling the government to check.
Hello there. Where are we now? Monday, and it's the 8th of April. Gosh, a new tax year for some people. And we're deep in the heart of Brexit once more. Where else could we be? Friday is the official date in law that the United Kingdom leaves the European Union. And at the present time, it could well be without a deal. Everybody's scuttling around trying to do this, that, and everything else. Andrea Leadsom has been on her feet in the Commons just a few moments ago, telling everybody that the government should be responsible for organising all the different things in the House of Commons. But she was cross that the politics have been taken over by the Chamber and the MPs there. And we'll come to that in a few minutes' time, but in the meantime, Theresa May has been flying over to Berlin to have a cup of tea and a kuchen with Angela Merkel. We haven't really heard anything that's come out of that meeting yet, but if we do hear anything during the course of our discussions with you this evening, we'll let you know. She's then going to go off and see, there's a lovely picture of Theresa and Angela. I don't know if that was taken just now. She's got a heavy overcoat on. It looks like an older picture, but maybe it was this morning. It could be colder in Berlin than it is in Glasgow, although a ripping wind came down the road today when I was wandering. Anyway, so some MPs in the House of Commons have warned President Macron, the French president, over the danger of short-term victories and playing to a domestic audience over Brexit. Tom Tugendhat, the Conservative chairman of the Commons Foreign Affairs Committee, told some people today that it's easy to look for short-term victories in complex relationships. Bearing in mind Mr. Macron has fired several warning shots over the situation of a no-deal Brexit. Tom Tugendhat went on and said, as President Macron decides how to act at the European Council on Wednesday, I hope he's thinking of the future, not just the present. Interesting. Anyway, further to that, Michel Barnier has been to Ireland today to have talks with Leo Varadkar, the Taoiseach, and Mr. Barnier has said he hopes that the government and Labour talks back in London will produce a positive outcome. The political declaration can accommodate a range of outcomes, he said, including a customs union, and the EU would grant a customs union if it were asked for. If there is a no deal, the European Union's priority will be to protect the single market. If there is a no deal, the EU will not discuss future trade relationships without an Irish backstop and proper citizens' rights. Michel Barnier said that he'd had constructive talks with the Taoiseach, and Leo Varadkar said, I discussed developments in the UK, including the cross-party talks, which are underway. Ireland is open to a further extension to allow these talks to come to a conclusion. However, due to the ongoing uncertainty, we also continue to intensify our no-deal Brexit preparations. We also discussed the length of the possible extension, and I look forward to discussing this further with my EU counterparts on Wednesday. There will, of course, be different views, but I'm confident that we can reach an agreement. Meanwhile, back in London, Keir Starmer, the Labour Party's Brexit man, said, "We had exchanges over the weekend, but not talks. There are no scheduled talks yet, but I have no doubt things will develop today. At the moment, we are waiting to see what the government has to offer and to put on the table as a proposal. All they have done so far is indicate various things, but not to change the political declaration. So the ball is in the government's court. We need to see what they come back with, and when they do, we will make a collective position on that. Labour and government officials will hold further talks tonight." Brexit has filled the House of Lords too today with debate. In many ways, it was a mirror of what happened in the Commons last Wednesday when we were together. Conservative peers were trying to filibuster the situation to run it down on time because it has to go through in one day. Lord Howard, who was actually a former Conservative leader, said it was an appalling piece of legislation and totally misconceived. It seeks to restrain the exercise of the royal prerogative by the Prime Minister. He and others tried to suggest that it would set a precedent and could be misused by others in the future. Lord Wigley, who's Plaid Cymru, said that the danger that the country reaches a no-deal situation on Friday midnight is absolutely unbelievable. He said that, sorry, I've lost my place, my fault. He said that he tried to table an amendment on the lines of Joanna Cherry's motion, which was put before the Parliament last week, but failed to gain a place. He said that this amendment would have ruled out, his amendment was ruled out by the clerks as being outside the bill's competence. He could not understand that, for Joanna Cherry's was in order, and how his could be out of order, he couldn't understand. If the government fails to pass a meaningful vote or fails to gain an extension, we will face a no-deal scenario. The government would be required to table a motion asking the House if it approved of leaving without a deal, and if the motion failed to pass, the government would be compelled to revoke Article 50. So really what Lord Wigley's amendment would have said was to reinstate the things that were in Joanna Cherry's motion last week. And he said it was just a safety net to prevent leaving without a deal, with the danger to jobs, wages and security, which is from the government's own analysis. About an hour ago, the Lords have passed by a majority of 234 Yvette Cooper's bill, with all the amendments, which they were all accepted by the House of Lords. So we now have to wait till that gets pushed back into the... So it's got to go back to the House of Commons now, and they've allocated 90 minutes tomorrow morning for it as well. So however long they sit tonight, I don't know. I don't suppose anybody does yet. Maybe 10 o'clock, but they did go on much later the other night. Okay, so over the past, we've got another story, and this is Scottish Jobs, but it is related to the previous story, and we decided we were going to do it in the other order. Over the past 40-odd years, the economy of Scotland has become more interlinked with the European Union. The Fraser Alder Institution, Fraser of Allender Institute, has published new research. Scottish jobs, which are linked to the demand for products exported from Scotland to the European Union, have risen by 9,000 over the past 2 years. The total number of jobs linked to exports to the European Union from Scotland is now 144,000. Looking at that figure in monetary terms, it is 14.9 billion pounds worth of goods and services sold into the European Union each year. Quite a sum. Gary Gillespie was appointed to the Scottish Government as Scottish Government Director and Chief Economist in September 2011. He's predicted that Brexit has the potential to push the Scottish economy into recession, causing gross domestic product to fall by 7%. MSP Annabel Ewing said that these figures simply reinforce the fact that the economic impact of crashing out of the EU with no deal is set to be severe. Nobody voted to make the country poorer, which is why the SNP has consistently argued for the best option for Scotland is to stay in the EU. She went on to say, it is clear that the Tory government thinks they can do what they want to with Scotland and get away with it. But people will not stand for their reckless gambling with Scottish jobs and Scotland's economy. Now, we move on to Boris Johnson. The Office of Parliamentary Standards have found that Boris Johnson has once again failed to report his income correctly and properly. Mr. Johnson was late in registering income received from a 20% share of a property in Somerset. Mr. Johnson has been accused of lack of respect and of having a pattern of behaviour. It is said that Mr. Johnson has an over-casual attitude towards obeying the rules and does not demonstrate leadership. Last December, he had to apologise for failing to declare royalties on sales of books which he had written, and also had to be held to account over speaking events where he'd been paid £95,000 for a 2-hour speech. And there was another for £51,000. Mr. Johnson takes home a salary for his work as an MP of £73,079, as well as a salary from his Daily Telegraph column, which is £275. Well, make of that what you will. I don't know how much you earn. But it seems to be quite a lot of money for a 2-hour speech. Now, that is actually as much as I was able to prepare before we started to come on air. It takes a lot of effort to put all this stuff together. But working in the back room, other folk have been putting other things together, which I'll now try and cobble together in front of you. The sad events of November the 29th, 2013, when the helicopter crashed into the Clutha Bar. It was a terrible night, and now the ramifications of that are being made public. The Fatal Accident Inquiry has heard statements, it's opened and it's heard statements of 10 of the victims, and there was a minute's silence observed. The Fatal Accident Inquiry heard from a number of people, including a taxi driver and pedestrians. Pilot David Turrell, who was 51, PC Tony Collins, who was 43, PC Kirsty Nellis, who was 36, all lost their lives, along with 7 customers who were in the bar in Stockwell Street. They were Gary Arthur, who was 48, Joe Cusker, who was 59, Colin Gibson, who was 33, Robert Jenkins, who was 61, John McCrell, who was 57, Samuel McGee, who was 56, and Mark O'Perry, who was 44. There was evidence from Ernest Doherty, who's 64. He told the inquiry that the helicopter was like an old car trying to start, but 1,000 times louder. The retired transport worker said the noise grew louder as it flew overhead, causing him to hunch in the street. Andrew Bergen, who's 30, was walking along by the riverbank and he saw the helicopter flying normally. Anyway, those family statements were made, and obviously, if you remember that in 2013, you'll know it was just a terrible thing. And obviously, this inquiry will go on for several more days, and we'll see how that goes. I'll just read out the last bit of this. There's a bit of a timeline from the helicopter crash in 29 November. Then in December 2013, there was a preliminary report which found that there was 95 litres of fuel on board the aircraft. On February the 14th, 2014, there was an AAIB special report, and it found that both engines flamed out. One of the fuel tanks was empty, and the second had only 0.4 litres. The third contained 75 litres, but transfer pumps to take the fuel from the other two engine tanks had been switched off. In 23rd of October 2015, the AAIB final report found that the cause of the accident was mismanagement of the fuel system by the pilot. On the 24th of November 2017, the fatal accident inquiry was announced, and that's what. Yeah, and of course the family of the pilot are hoping to clear the name of the pilot, because obviously this is not a final thing. This is just what they found at that time. Yeah, we'll see what happens as the time goes by, but of course it was a lamentable tragedy for so many people, and not a kind of thing that we'd like to report on, but of course it's something that's happened, and we're letting you know as much as we know about it. Obviously more things will come to light. Now, in the light of what we said about Boris Johnson a few minutes ago, one knows that he's ambitious to become Prime Minister of the United Kingdom. And there's every once in a while, and this is the up-to-date report, they do an audit of people's political awareness, their attitudes, how they think about things, how they feel about things, and it's quite a long report, and frankly I haven't had time to delve in it too much. I have been pointed out a certain part of it, which I'll come to in a minute, but just to give you a bit more idea, there's a question. The first bit of it says 1, options of the systems of government. Options of the systems governing are at their lowest point in the 15-year audit series. Worst now than in the aftermath of the MP's expenses scandal. 2, appetite for radical political changes. People are pessimistic about the country's problems and their possible solution, and with sizable numbers willing to entertain radical political changes. Might want to take a pause and think about that one for a minute. The third one on the title page is feelings of powerlessness and disengagement. Core indicators of political engagement remain stable, but beneath the surface, the strongest feelings of powerlessness and disengagement are intensifying. So opinions on the system of governing are at their lowest point in 15 years. 72% say that the system of governing needs quite a lot or a great deal of improvement. I wonder why that is. I mean, is it because people don't engage with all the things that are going on in their parliaments, or don't have hands-on experience, or is it just because they get most of what they know from the television or radio or newspapers? There's a number of people who say that the system needs a great deal of improvement, and that's risen by 8 points in a year to 37%. Asked whether the problem of the system or the people, whether it's the system or the people, the largest group, 38%, say both. So it's both the system and the people, according to what people say. Britons have more confidence in the military and in judges than they do in politicians to act in the public interest. So people think that the judges and the military would act in the public interest far more than politicians would. Yeah. So I'll skip a little bit. It's actually not that much I'm skipping, because I'm turning over to the kind of the fourth page of this. But it says at the top, 54%. People are pessimistic about the country's problems and their possible solution, with sizable numbers willing to entertain radical political changes. That's how I read back a few moments ago. Well over half the public are downbeat about the state of Britain. 56% think that Britain is in decline. 63% think that Britain's system of government is rigged in advantage of the rich and the powerful. And 66% think that the big issues facing the country today don't have clear solutions. Here's the big one. Take a deep breath. Listen carefully. 54% say Britain needs a strong leader who is willing to break the rules. Authoritarianism, we've seen this break out in America, we've seen it in South America, we've seen it in the Philippines, and we witness it in Turkey, Austria, and the rise of the right. Take a deep breath and think. Boris Johnson is reported today because he hasn't filled in his expenses, and it says that he's willing to flout the rules. Will we want him as Prime Minister? I don't know. That's not for me to say. Yeah, I'm going to go on with a little bit more of this because it's quite interesting stuff, I think. There's all right. I'll just give you a little bit more from this page here, and then I'll try and find another bit that's been spoken to me about in my ear. 42% think many of the country's problems could be dealt with more efficiently if the government didn't have to worry so much about votes in Parliament. Yeah, marginally more people prefer experienced political parties and leaders who have been in power before, 47%, to those with radical ideas for change who haven't been in power before, 43%. Well, that casts a bit of a problem for new parties, doesn't it? 55% still think that the big questions should be put to the public in referendums more often than they are today. Now, for that to happen, you really need to trip over the system that we have for government here. You really need to start to thinking about how you've really got to start to think about how the Swiss run their system, where they have 4 referendums each year, and anybody who can gather enough signatures can bring forward any motion to be voted upon. Indeed, when I lived there, they had a referendum on should they close all the roads on a Sunday to allow people to go and roller skate and ride their bicycles without fear of being run over by a lorry. Now, I'm still trying to find this next part, which is about... I cannot find it. Can you tell me again in my ear? I don't know, I think we could have just gone on until we found it, really. I'll read this bit because I don't want you to get too bored while you're watching, if you're watching. I mean, who knows if anybody's watching. 32% say they would not want to be involved at all in local decision making. That's a rise of 10 points a year. 47% feel that they have no influence over all the national decision making, a new high for the audit series. The number who strongly disagree that political involvement can change the way the UK is run has hit a 15%, a 15-year high. Feelings of disempowerment and disengagement. 42% think that they would be better off if the government didn't have to worry so much about parliamentary votes. I just read that somewhere else. 55% still think that the big questions should be put to public referendums. We talked about that a few minutes ago. Further back, the appetite for... Well, that's because I came to the end. Do you know, I don't think it is on that one. I think it's on the other piece of paper. Well, I tell you what we'll do. We'll see if we can find that in a minute, and then we come back to it if we can. I'm going to put that to the side now. And we'll move on. So we got things about all this austerity, the callous Tory policy cuts, it says. The SNP has called for the Tory government to scrap callous benefit freeze that will cut a further 4.4 billion from social security payments, almost $1 billion more than planned as these toxic Tory policy enters their fourth year. It is actually the final year. The benefit freeze introduced by the Tories in 2016 has seen most working age benefits remain the same as in 2015 and 16, whilst prices for goods and services have risen by 6.6% since then. This is a massive real terms cut to people's incomes. By the end of this final year, the benefits freeze will have negatively impacted more than 27 million people. They've plunged 400,000 people into poverty. This year alone will see a huge number of social security claimants worse off by hundreds of pounds, particularly people with disabilities and families with children who could be left over £700 poorer due to the additional detrimental impact of this Tory two-child cap, that rape clause that we've often mentioned in the past. If the freeze hadn't been imposed, if the freeze hadn't been imposed, parents with one child would be better off by 255 and 20 pence a year this year. The disabled lone parent on universal credit looking for work after April 2017 would be better off by £564, and ending the freeze 1 year early would benefit 2.1 million people in Scotland, with 800,000 benefiting by more than £100 or more this year. That was all from the Joseph Rowntree Trust Foundation, I beg your pardon. Neil Gray, MP for the SNP Work and Pensions spokesman, said this: the Tory government must scrap the final year of this callous benefit freeze and increase benefits in line with inflation before the further 4.4 billion, almost $1 billion more than planned, is taken from the pockets of those least able to bear it. I mean, you do have to think to yourself, with Boris Johnson taking 50 or 95,000, £1,000 for a 2-hour speech, and we're talking about taking hundreds of pounds out of the pockets of the least well able. Targeting austerity at the most disadvantaged and pursuing a policy that will plunge thousands into poverty is nothing short of a moral outrage. And this Tory government should hang its head in shame. The benefits freeze is a political choice, not a necessity. The SNP opposed the policy from the beginning, and the UK government must end the cruel approach to lift the freeze, and lift the freeze immediately. So another raft of Tory cuts of austerity blowing through the world today. And in another part of the world, others are suffering terribly. Another thing that was left undone by the Tory government some time ago, David Cameron's intervention into Libya. So a warplane attacked Tripoli's only functioning airport on Monday as Eastern forces advanced on the Libyan capital, Tripoli, and disregarded international appeals for a truce. The latest cycle of warfare since Colonel Gaddafi's downfall in 2011. Stephen Gethin's MP called an emergency question in the House of Commons about this today. Eastern Libyan National Army, the LNA, of forces of Haftar, the man Haftar, he's another general. He was in former Gaddafi's army, said 19 of his soldiers died in recent days as they closed in on the internationally recognized government in Tripoli. A spokesman for the Tripoli-based health ministry said fighting in the south of the capital had killed at least 25 people, including fighters and civilians, and wounded 80. The airport in the eastern suburb was bombarded and closed. Authorities said that it left the airport of Misrata 200 kilometers, that's 125 miles, to the east down on the coast, the closest operational airport for Tripoli residents. So there's another war and another lot of fighting, another load of killing and another load of dying of people who probably could have lived a decent kind of life. So we pass through now to oil. I suppose that links a bit with Libya because oil comes from the Middle East, a lot of it. And this is a story about oil prices. The other day I mentioned to you that oil prices had risen to a high. They've gone further still. Oil prices rose to their highest level since November 2018. This was driven upwards by OPEC's ongoing supply cuts, US sanctions against Iran and Venezuela, who were having trouble with their electricity supplies to their production places and their ports the other day. Fighting in Libya, of course, has also gone to help that price rise, along with strong data from the United States about jobs. The US West Texas Intermediate crude prices were up 30 cents, or 0.05%, at $63.39 a barrel. Brent crude and the WTI both hit their highest since November at $70.76 and $63.48 a barrel respectively today. Yeah, so now the cost of recovering North Sea oil has dropped. The figures were by about $10 to $15. It was over $100. They've dropped. When the price was over $100, it cost much more, but these prices for recovering the oil from the North Sea have gone down very, very much. So the profit margins are much higher for the oil companies. Let me see, what else can I tell you from here? Probably enough. What do you think? Oil. We found much more of it in the North Sea, but of course we should be moving towards renewables and leaving that stuff where it is. But of course we do need it for other things besides driving our cars. So we move on to this story. Now, we're quite unsure of how we're going to continue on with the program tonight. We might just end it because we don't know exactly what's happening to the bill of Yvette Cooper's coming back to the House of Parliament. We might put you back onto the Parliament and then come back and talk to you a bit later. We haven't decided. But this is the last story in our pile at the moment. It's a new poll, and this is what we were looking for a few moments ago. This is a new poll from the. It's talking about the SNP being the only party standing up for Scotland's interests. The SNP is succeeding against Westminster despair, as a new poll reveals support for the Tories and Labour has plummeted as the result of their incompetence over Brexit. A survey for Politico finds that both the government and opposition lack credibility on Brexit in Scotland, highlighting the feelings of deep national discontent and branding both parties out of touch and incompetent. According to the poll of a cluster of constituencies in Scotland, the Tories and the Labour are lagging behind the SNP on key policy issues such as health, housing, education and crime. Almost 50% of those surveyed believe that the SNP represents people like me, in comparison to Labour's 22.1% and the Tories' 14.3%. Deputy Leader Keith Brown said, "This latest polling highlights the complete lack of trust in both the Tories and the Labour. Both parties have repeatedly proven that they have nothing to offer Scotland but economic chaos, division and incompetence." Now, if I turn the page over, this is the... Okay, well, we're going to look in at Parliament, but maybe we'll come back to this later. But as I said, we haven't decided what we're going to do. So anyway, let's take a look at what's happening in Westminster now.
Worth to take, and what the moral cause was, and why actually trade shouldn't just be about profit, but it should be about overall prosperity and also moral righteousness at the same time. And I have to say, Mr. Deputy Speaker, what is increasingly important about these kind of statutory instruments, and to make sure that we have such explicit elements in our legal system, both domestically and also internationally, is that element of transparency. In the past, before I came to this place, I worked in finance. I draw my members to my register of interest, but I was able to work abroad. I worked in several Asian countries, which are far less democratic than our own. There I regularly heard of individual cases where people were subjected to overt and covert and explicit and emotional torture, and no one was ever held to account. There wasn't that transparency in the judiciary to hold people account, and certainly there was no authority to hold the government to account, or indeed individual traders or merchants involved in supplying the materials that facilitated that kind of torture. And, Mr. Speaker, when you see people who are actively outside taking part in the political political demonstration, of which we see every day outside this place, when you're in a country where you actually see those individuals taken away, bundled into a van, and then never heard of again, that is where you start to understand the importance of this type of legislation and why the United Kingdom's place as a leader for human rights and it taking its position against torture is so important. I also, Mr. Deputy Speaker, want to mention the importance of maintaining standards. It's something that we probably are acutely aware of in this House just now. It's certainly something that we probably need to reflect on more and more. But it's also the importance of our country maintaining standards across the world. In the last 2 decades, and certainly as I was going through my education, I saw the United Kingdom soften its lines and sometimes let its standards slip, whether it was in the misadministration in Iraq, whether it was not adhering to red lines in Syria. And these mistakes cost so many lives, both at home and abroad. And these ghosts will haunt us for many years to come. And it's not the kind of mistakes that we can dare to repeat in this place or elsewhere. So we must continue to champion human rights, Mr. Deputy Speaker. We must continue to reinforce the international order, and we must continue to set new standards so that when challenges arise to the international order, new challenges in whatever form they may be, this House can rise to meet those challenges and make sure that we lead people together in prosperity, in peace, and in moral authority.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker, and it's been a great pleasure to participate in this debate. We've heard powerful speeches, not least by the opposition spokeswoman, but also from the SNP benches and from my colleagues from Tunbridge and Malling and indeed from Ochil and South Perthshire, as we've just seen. In dealing with most of the questions that came my way came from the opposition front bench, as is perhaps appropriate. In terms of asking about what happened with this process, the original had to be withdrawn when the EU regulation was codified into a new version. So splitting the UK legislation was the most expedient way of dealing with this problem, and I really do appreciate the Honourable Lady's support for what we're trying to do tonight. We have no further amendments planned, and I can confirm that the Government will maintain strong controls over the trade in goods usable for capital punishment or torture. She asked about precedent from other states. When we leave the EU, we will no longer receive information from other member states about licences that they've refused. We will, however, continue to take account of all relevant information that comes our way when assessing licence applications. And, as this goes to the heart of the question I was asked from the SNP benches, we would welcome the opportunity to continue cooperation with the EU, but this will be subject to whatever settlement we finally agree. The Honourable Lady asked me about reporting and transparency. We will report annually going forward, and our aim, as ever, is to be, I think right now we publish more information than almost any other nation, and we want to continue with that transparent approach going forward. The UK does, of course, operate one of the most rigorous and transparent export licensing systems in the world.
So they're talking in the Commons about exporting torture stuff, and that's pretty interesting, I suppose, because it's all to do with the Brexit too. The last part of that story we're doing before we went back to the Commons. Anyway, the SNP is leading the Labour and the Tories over every major issue at the moment. That's what the story said. And so I think what we're going to do, we're going to say thank you very much for watching us, and I hope you have been watching us. I hope you watch us again tomorrow. And the Westminster Live programme will continue on Broadcasting Scotland now, and so you can watch the bill that Yvette Cooper brought before the House last week. Has been through the House of Lords today. It has to come back to the House of Commons now, and it will pass probably, and that will become law because the Queen will sign it, and then but it'll probably be tomorrow. They've got 90 minutes tomorrow morning to finish it off if they've run out of steam tonight. It really is quite difficult because you know, there was a man he asked Michelangelo how to make the most wonderful statue of David, and so Michelangelo said, well, you just take a bit of marble and knock all the bits off that don't look like David. And that's really what we do here, although I'm not suggesting we make statues like David, but we've got the pile of information in the other room, and we sift through it and see what we think is going to be good to tell you tonight, and we try and present that the best we can. Obviously, if we had more resources, more time, more people, we could do better. But we've done what we can tonight. I hope it's been acceptable. Hope my face hasn't been too bad to look at while you've been watching, if you have been. And so we'll say goodnight to you tonight, and we'll hopefully see you tomorrow. Thank you.
In South Africa in 1960, when police opened fire and killed 69 people at a peaceful demonstration against the apartheid passed laws. The day was proclaimed 6 years later through a United Nations resolution, elimination of all forms of racial discrimination adopted on 26 October 1966. While the International Day for the Elimination of Racial Discrimination